So let's talk about some gas masks, cavalry charges, artillery bombardments, and a disturbing sense of duty to martyr yourself for the Emperor, with some thoughts on starting a Death Korps of Krieg army in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Death Korps, and in this video I thought it could be good to do a general overview of starting the faction, talking through why you might want to collect one in the first place, some thoughts on a few different directions that you could take an army, a look at each one of their dedicated units and some thoughts to expand upon them, a few thoughts on the Siege Regiment, and one idea for a starter army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect a Death Korps army in the first place? The Death Korps of Krieg are an Imperial Guard regiment with a pretty unique history, a regiment greatly developed in the Forge World series of Imperial armour books that got very popular and now has been brought into the fold as one of the main regiments that Games Workshop supports for plastic kits for 40k. They're a regiment that's styled around World War I infantry, and despite a fairly German sounding name, they've got a good bunch of themes from French and British troops as well. Generally great war infantry through and through, all barbed wire and gas masks and trench coats and things. In the lore in the Warhammer 40k setting, the world of Krieg is an isolated world that suffered a great rebellion against the Imperium and basically had a long and brutal civil war, eventually the Loyalists emerging victorious, ultimately crushing the rebellion but not before reducing much of the planet to ash with nuclear weapons. Following this horrendous series of events, the planet that emerged still bears the constant psychological scars. The Kriegsmen have a great cult of sacrifice instilled into them from an early age by conditioning, every man knowing that it's ultimately their fate to lay down the life for the Emperor and to be utterly fearless of death, sometimes to a perhaps near unhelpful extent, with commissars assigned to them from elsewhere, more needing to try and instill a sense of self-preservation amongst their charges, more so than goad them forward with a bolt pistol. The Krieg soldiers are thought to be backgrown below the planet's surface, rarely being seen without their gas masks and helmets on, and typically when they make war it's often with famed siege regiments, with infantry and clawed cavalry steeds, charging towards the enemy and taking the ground, all backed up by pounding artillery and grinding the enemy down in a grim war of attrition. Obviously all that's a warm-up though before the Kriegsmen pick up their shovels and entrenching tools. That's when the enemy Chaos Marines really have to fear. As mentioned, the regiment had really quite a lot of lore and background developed with the Imperial armour books, maybe most notably the Siege of Rax. They had a big Forge World resin range, and the rules often working sort of a bit clunkily in parallel with Warhammer 40k, though in general Forge World has been wound down in the Warhammer 40k setting over the past few years, meaning that the Krieg were getting less and less support, but it seems that Games Workshop decided that they were popular enough that they'd have an entire release wave themed around them, lots of their units getting either resculpts or near analogues released in plastic. As a result, in terms of Games Workshop miniatures, besides the Cadians perhaps, the Krieg have the very best range out of any Guard regiment. 7 themed kits in total. They've got an Infantry Squad and a Kill Team Veterans variant, a Death Korps Command Squad led by a Commissar, a Heavy Weapons Team, Artillery Team, Death Riders and their named character, and some Combat Engineers. Beyond that they've got access to the really big Astra Militarum range, which has got lots of tanks, war machines and artillery. Plenty of the kits are fairly regiment agnostic, they're not really overly Krieg themed, just doing a few head swaps for things like some gas masks could go a really long way to up the theme though. You certainly could have different regiments fighting side by side, you don't have to go pure Krieg if you don't want to, and plenty of things are just sort of generic guard support things that you might have attached to a regiment, perhaps some Tempestus Scions or Militarum Auxilia. For a brief look through their miniatures, they've got the pounding guns of the artillery team with a bunch of different variant weapons that it can field, a Krieg command squad led by a commissar and an aspiring commissar, lots of specialists including a sinister alchemist and a vox operator, combat engineer sappers armed with trench clubs or shotguns, and one big and scary remote mine propelled forward on corkscrews. As the standard Death Korps of Krieg infantry squad on the left, the Kill Team variant pictured has a bunch of different specialists in it. There's options to both buy it as the standard infantry squad and having the extra bits, as we'll cycle back to later, a Krieg heavy weapon squad with a fire coordinator calling the shots. And then they've got their Death Riders, maybe one of their most iconic units with their disturbing clawed steeds with gas masks on, and their named special character, Lord Marshal Dreyer, commanding the cavalry from the front lines and thought to be near indestructible, with so many seemingly impossible situations that he's managed to survive. As mentioned, they do have access to the rest of the Guard stuff, things like Lehman Russ battle tanks, Sentinels, Death Strike missile launchers and more. Plus Militarum Auxilia such as these Bullgrins here, Commissars to keep order, and the Hulking Baneblade Super Heavy Tank. As mentioned, they did have a really big range in Forge World resin previously. While a whole bunch of things did get converted to plastic, even if they might have changed their form a bit, a few things just aren't really supported all that much. Perhaps things like their Mars Alpha Lehman Russ variant that looked a bit different. The Solar Auxilia one could maybe be a good stand-in for that if you wanted something that looked the part. They had multiple variant and fairly nicely sculpted resin infantry squads as well, even if they did really cost quite a lot. And a few other things that didn't get directly translated, such as the Quartermaster Cadre or the Centaur Artillery Tractor and Battlefield Command type vehicle. If you did manage to either acquire or convert something to proxy for these things, most of them still have Legends rules in the download section of the Warhammer community site. And bear in mind that there's options beyond Games Workshop as well. Lots of 3D printing creators out there that make some generic sci-fi guys with gas masks, which is at least a fairly common trope. Quite a lot of these have got quite big developed ranges as well, things like the Maker's Cult Valor Corps or the Station Forge Grimguard, but there's plenty more cool sculpts out there. 3D printing options could certainly be interesting enough to people trying to take the edge off the pricing though, as the Astra Militarum and perhaps Death Korps particularly are very expensive to collect. Generally guard units don't tend to be all that elite, but still charged at a fairly hefty price. So the amounts of points that you get on the table for any amount spent tends to be quite low, so collecting a guard army often tends to be a really slow, long process that could take a fair bit longer versus collecting an army of a different faction. In particular, the infantry and cavalry things don't tend to cost all that many points in game. It can be a bit better for things like tanks and artillery systems, maybe Lehman Russes being some of the more efficient ways to get points on the board, but unless doing clever things with 3D printing or second-hand miniatures or sticking to a tank regiment, otherwise the Astra Militarum are going to be very expensive to put on the table. I guess the move from Forge World resin did help things a little bit, but maybe not by quite as much as you might have hoped. Gameplay-wise, the Death Korps use the rules from Codex Astra Militarum. Sub-factions and things work a bit differently for the Astra Militarum, and also have their quirks in 10th edition as well. So if you want to, you can collect a just completely combined Astra Militarum range, and have units from Cadians, Kaschans and Death Korps all mixed in, and then pick literally any one of the detachments if you'd like to. If you're trying to collect a more dedicated Death Korps of Krieg style army though, that's probably going to mean that you're going to look down certain units and certain detachment options a bit more than others. There are plenty of ways that you could make things work for a whole bunch of them if you wanted to. In terms of playstyle, Guard tend to be a very classically range-focused army, generally cheap horde-style infantry units to hold the mid-board objectives, backed up by powerful guns with tanks and maybe some indirect fire from artillery. Their core rule, like the rest of the Guard, are the orders, having a command structure to make your units shoot straighter, move faster, and take cover where needed, which is quite a fun and interactive one I think. And for the most part I feel like most of the Guard range is pretty powerful and playable in game, although I'll go through the Krieg ones individually, I feel like there are some that are winners and losers there. Currently power-wise, Guard are looking fairly strong, maybe certain builds doing a bit better than others on competitive tournament tables and things though, but plenty of Krieg units are seen playing competitive lists, things like combat engineers, artillery teams and heavy weapon squads all doing fairly well, and the infantry squad is pretty fine too. In any case, if you want a World War I style Guard army, or very willing to lay down the lives for the Emperor with a good old bayonet charge, a fun recent range of plastic miniatures, and a grueling attrition warfare backed up by some big guns, then the Death Korps might be for you. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA, made some fancy dice for this channel, and generally their thing is to have a vast array of dice available, many of which could tie in with certain themes and armies and sub-factions from different wargames out there. There's a couple of things that might appeal to Guard players, plenty of military green dice, and in particular quite a fun one that has the different orders on the different faces. That could be a good way to mark out your orders that you've given to each unit as you go along. They've just got a massive amount of various different faction themed dice too, everything from Golden Guardians to big knightly robots, various different chapter ones, or ones that could be appropriate for the Ecclesiarchy. They generally come in sets of 25, usually for £29 or $32 shipped out from the USA. If you were looking to pick any of them up, there's a discount code ALLSPECS for 5% off, so that could save a little bit. As mentioned, they also have some fun channel dice as well, if you did want some dice with the channel logo. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. They'll be linked down in the video description below if you'd like to check them out. Back to Krieg things though, and presuming that you choose to collect a Death Korps of Krieg army, let's talk about some of the things that you could do to plan out a collection. For gathering a bit more information on the Guard and Krieg in general, Codex Astra Militarum could be a fairly handy one to pick up at least fairly soon, as it has the unit profiles, rules and miniature showcases from Games Workshop. If you wanted to mess around with army lists and things, then maybe Warhapedia or New Recruits could be handy enough. If you want to see what an army could look like before even picking up the codex, you could proxy models in games to see what a force of them would feel like on the tabletop with you at the command, or use Tabletop Simulator to do the same if that's something that you do. There's a massive amount of Death Korps content on YouTube, particularly given the big plastic release wave that Games Workshop did in the not too distant past. I've made an Imperial Guard Codex review and a tier list ranking the units, and there'll certainly be a few more videos to come. There's all manner of battle reports, painting guides, and a bunch of Krieg lore from all manner of other content creators as well. Again, loads of stuff got made in early 2025 around the Guard release. It's maybe not the worst idea to follow along with various Astra Militarum social media out there, Discord servers, Facebook groups and subreddits. They can be places to either ask basic questions to existing hobbyists, or just imbibe the general sort of theme and discussions people are having and how to solve common problems while collecting an army. Early on in the process, it can be a good idea to plan out a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point list, maybe using New Recruit or the Warhammer 40K app if you have that, just as that could give you an idea as to what you might actually wind up with after collecting a bunch of miniatures. Guard in general can do a whole bunch of army archetypes, and while Krieg might have their iconic infantry advances and artillery kind of playstyle, you could still make them work for all manner of other regiments out there as well, maybe going for a more mechanised approach or a fairly tank heavy army. Maybe one of the bigger decisions would be whether or not you're going for a sort of pure Krieg aesthetic to the army. So basically trying to have all your guardsmen with their gas masks and iconic look and doing a bit of conversion and modelling work to make various different units work for them. Or if you're happy to go for a little bit more of a mixed regiment approach, it is fairly common in the Imperial Guard lore to have different regiments working side by side and sometimes being consolidated from the depleted remains of other regiments, so there is plenty of justification as to why your Kriegsmen might be fighting alongside say Acadians or Kaschans or others. It just depends whether or not you like that kind of aesthetic as sort of a mixed humanity approach to fighting the enemy. We specifically want to collect a Death Korps siege regiment. Other ways to approach a force as well could be to make up your own given lore for one Krieg regiment, maybe have a couple of your own custom generals commanding them, and theme the force to their quirks and personality, or to build around one of the detachments from Codex Astra Militarum, and maybe collect to some of the units that could work in game for that. The Guard have 6 options for detachments that they can field at the moment: a combined arms regiment, which generally tends to be best with balanced guard shooting and some support from infantry and tanks, a recon element that tends to be very foot guard heavy, making infantry quite durable, which could be quite nice for Krieg advances and their skirmish cavalry. As mentioned, the siege regiment, themed around an infantry assault being backed up by covering fire from theoretical guns off the map. The Hammer of the Emperor is the tank formation, mechanised assault for infantry jumping out of Tauroxes and Chimeras and things, and the Bridgehead Strike, which is largely themed around Militarum Tempestus, though does have some good support for other infantry as well, and the reroll ones to hit is quite nice for the artillery teams too. If you did go for their maybe more themed siege regiment though, it's probably not considered to be one of the very strongest guard regiments, though it does have some interesting rules. At the start of each battle round you can pick one of 3 debuffs to affect a bunch of enemy units to represent covering fire from artillery, either having the chance to slow them down by 2 inches, or ignore cover on those targets, or you can pick a few of your own units to grant the stealth ability to, if the main thing that's important is your unit surviving in the open. I think the rules are interesting enough. The slowing movement one could be pretty devastating if you do get lucky and affect an important melee unit with that. Ignores cover is a pretty great debuff and could help your on the board artillery, and stealth is nice enough if you're against a shooting opponent. Then to back that up, they've got a whole bunch of stratagems. I say maybe the more reliably useful ones are the reroll hit rolls within 12 inches for a character keyword unit. That could be nice enough on a big massed up platoon squad or maybe a Rogal Dawn tank commander, and you could combine it with the +1 attack for a platoon unit within half range. That could get you a pretty serious volley of plasma guns and las guns. The one that's over the top, which is move, move, move for all infantry on the board, does seem quite a fun one as well. It does feel all very thematic even if it's a bit expensive, and realistically orders aren't the hardest to have going around with command squads. Otherwise they've got some enhancements, including getting a scout for a unit, a deny Overwatch one, a fun boosted legacy sidearm to give you a 3-shot plasma pistol, and doubling down on getting take cover whenever you have an order issued to the squad, which could be quite fun to both make them more dangerous and also tougher, or faster and tougher at the same time. Overall, between all this, it maybe encourages platoon infantry squads a bit more so than other regiments. Lots of support for guard infantry getting into the mid-board and being a bit tougher when they get there. I still think in general though you probably want to back them up with some other big guns and tanks, even if the infantry element might be a bit emphasised. Otherwise, for things to plan when getting an army, you can think about the colour scheme and painting up a test model. Likely an infantry guardsman being probably the best place to start here. They've got most of the things that will be present on your various other units, very representative of the faction, and far less investment than painting up a big character or vehicle model. I say for painting difficulty, there may be a sort of middling difficulty. The newer Krieg sculpts tend to be a fair bit more detailed than maybe some of the past Cadians that were fairly quick to paint up. Depending on the miniature, it might make more sense to spray in the sort of block colour for the armour and then a colour in the cloth, but given the Krieg trench coats and things, that might be a little bit less relevant for them compared with some others. Or the cloth on the infantry can be quite good for either contrast paints or from a bit of dry brushing and shading. And it might well be worth having a thought about some sort of spraying technique for big guard vehicles. They can be a lot easier to paint if you go for a sort of airbrush or spray can technique, even if it does mean that they're painted in a very slightly different style to the troops. For choice of colour schemes, you can absolutely make up your own regiment colour scheme style, or pick one of the many ones from the lore out there. The Imperial Armour books did have a good amount of examples. Typically, Kriegsmen generally tend to get seen in fairly drab colours, going for a somewhat practical World War I infantry style theme. Nothing to say that you can't have them be a bit more jazzy if you'd like to though. Talking of actually getting miniatures on the board though, for first purchases for a Death Korps army, I'd either go for a Krieg Infantry Squad, either the regular one or the Veterans, or if it's available to you at a reasonable price, perhaps the Death Korps of Krieg army set, the launch box that came out with their Death Riders and special characters and more. It's a bit unfortunate that the Guard Combat Patrol just isn't really particularly useful for a Krieg army, so they're kind of without any sort of current discount kit. If you do start with the Death Korps of Krieg Infantry Squad, then there's two different variants to this one. Either you can go with the standard infantry kit, which is $52, £31 or €41, so the same as the Cadian infantry, or there's the Death Korps Veterans Kill Team kit, which is a fair bit more expensive at $65, €55 or £42. The difference between the two is getting this extra frame in the kit, which allows you to build a bunch of the more kill team specialist type things and have a bunch of the infantry in some fun alternative poses. Some of the bits could be handy enough for sort of scattering amongst other guard kits as well. It'd mean that you'd have more spares left over when you've built a squad. So perhaps if you did wind up buying multiple of these, it might make some sense to get at least one of them for the kill team kit, but probably for the majority of the rank and file, you'd get by fine with the regular one. This is the current datasheet for the Death Korps of Krieg. They've got a slightly complicated weapon option thing that really wasn't written very clearly. Ultimately, between all the asterisks and things, it boils down to 2 special weapons and a med pack per 10 of them. Just annoyingly having the option of both plasma gun, melter gun and voxcaster altogether locked out, which isn't really the most helpful. The voxcaster gives you the chance to regenerate command points, so maybe it does depend a bit on how likely you think it is that the unit's going to be targeted by stratagems. Maybe in the siege regiment, if you've got a character attached, then you might. Otherwise though, probably I'd go plasma and melter gun, and then just maybe sub one out for the grenade launcher and voxcaster if you think that that stratagem regeneration is actually going to be helpful. The med packs are quite nice. With 2 of them in a 20-man squad, you get to regenerate D3+1 models in the command phase, and that can be quite nice for avoiding needing to take battle shock tests, or even just putting more models on objectives very quickly. As the unit takes casualties, it gets a fair bit more dangerous as well, adding +1 to hit and +1 to wound when they're very depleted. And that can make a squad unusually savage with the melter and plasma shots if the squad is badly injured but not destroyed. As it goes, a squad or 2 of them is handy enough to have advance into the midboard. Putting a whole load of OC there, and maybe along with the Cadian shock troops, they're one of the squads to go for if you actually want your squads to be a bit more of a damage and defense one, as opposed to the Kaschans that can just take flamers. As mentioned, you would have some options as to how you represent the various guard infantry units. You could have Kriegsmen fighting alongside Kaschan or Cadian models, though I think if it were me personally, I'd probably just stick to the Death Korps theme throughout the army, and then represent the Cadian and Kaschan units that I wanted to field by just having the Kriegsmen with the right war gear, and then making sure that they're visually distinct to represent the right units. Say for example, the Cadian ones are all the ones that have the red shoulder pads as well, so your opponent wouldn't get confused. Definitely different ways that you can do it though, and people have their own preferences. Just in general, when picking up Warhammer 40k miniatures, I'd be aware of the different ways in which you can do so. Direct from Games Workshop and their own Warhammer web store is generally the most reliable, but also the most expensive. Typically, if getting expensive new plastic, I'd generally be going by Warhammer discount retailer stores, just getting the same things but saving between 10 and 20% off depending on where you are around the world. There's loads of great examples of them around out there. The ones that are linked down in the video description help to support the channel. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games for 20%, Fenris Workshop for 10%, Wargame Portal for 15% in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep for 16% off in Germany and the EU. A big thank you to anyone supporting the channel via picking things up through those links when you do. Besides new plastic kits, there's certainly the option to go elsewhere as well though. The second-hand market could be well worth a look, particularly for maybe more classic style guard vehicles. Things like Chimeras and Lehman Rosses and things have a fair bit of turnover. There might be some people selling off some units individually from the Death Korps of Krieg launch box too. There may be not quite as good a supply of new Death Korps of Krieg miniatures, given that they've not been around so long, Can certainly be interesting enough if you want to save a little bit versus Games Workshop prices though, and you're willing to put up with a fair bit of variable quality. Beyond that, as mentioned, there's certainly a whole load of options out there with 3D printing and third-party manufacturers. Lots of great alternative sculpts exist, like the Valor Core from Maker's Cult or the Grim Guard from Station Forge. There's plenty more people making various flavours of sci-fi infantry in gas masks as well. Some of the ones that do parts like that, such as say alternative gas mask heads, could also be pretty helpful for customising other guard miniatures to look a little bit more Death Korps themed. While talking about starting the army, it's probably worth talking about the Death Korps of Krieg army set, which will be the only easy to access discount deal in recent times for the Krieg. Games Workshop did make a lot of copies of this, but it still sold out really quite fast as it was one of the most anticipated 40k box sets for a while, and contained a good chunk of the new Death Korps minis, the Artillery Battery, the Death Riders and Combat Engineers and Lord Marshal Dreyer, plus having the 10th edition Guard Codex. If you can find this at some sort of semblance of its initial prices, then it's probably worth the pickup if you are collecting a Death Korps army and you did want a hefty cavalry contingent. Perhaps places that you could check out could be brick and mortar Warhammer stores, maybe some discount retailers with not quite so much of an online presence, and there will be a fair few being resold online, though if the markup is quite a long way, then there's no real massive point in going for those, given that the only real value is that it's a discount set, and if the models aren't adequately discounted, then you may as well just pick up the exact miniatures that you wanted instead. The points in the box aren't particularly high though, it's around about 400 points or so. As ever with Death Korps of Krieg, you don't really get all that many points on the board for how much money you spend. Otherwise though, let's talk through the other specific Krieg units, both with their kit and their rules. Artillery teams are $62 or £40. They build 4 different options, and it's fairly straightforward to be able to assemble them in such a way in which you can swap out between them. I do quite like the miniatures with the big batteries with the sandbags, and then there's 3 Kriegsmen crewing them. In game, the one that you'd want to go for at the moment is the Siege Cannon. It's pretty much just flatly better than the rest for some reason. They're fairly sturdy for the points, though you can still hide them out of line of sight. They'd want an order to be able to hit on a 4+ indirect, and some detachments can help them out a bit. Maybe things like Ignores Cover from the Siege Regiment, or reroll ones to hit from Bridgehead Strike. It does seem that they're seen as adequately good to be able to be taken in competitive lists. You certainly do pay the premium for the indirect fire though. There is a lot of value to being able to hit the opponent's unit that they least want to have shot. The Combat Engineers gets you a team of 5 guys at $45 or £28. Quite fun Krieg specialist infantry in carapace armour, and they're the sort of sappers and underground warfare experts of the Krieg. Again, it seems that people find them interesting enough to put in lists. It's 70 points per 5 of them. They scout forward and then throw a whole load of mortal wounds around the board, both with using a free grenade stratagem and their remote mine. Could be interesting enough to put in transports given the big hitting mortal wounds that really need to get close, and they can take shotguns and trench clubs, though to be honest the choice doesn't matter so much. Probably shotguns and plasma pistol are best, but their real value is in the mortal wound output. For the Krieg heavy weapons, they're single crewed ones with a fire coordinator, $52 or £31, with a choice between las cannons, heavy stubbers or heavy flamers. The heavy flamers do seem to be the fashionable choice at the moment. At 75 points again, they're seen as pretty playable. Potentially for that cost you've got around about 10ish shots at damage 2 and ignores cover. Should be enough to murder some space marines on the mid-board objectives, and then they could both overwatch if it made sense, and also potentially fire on death with a fire coordinator too. So really quite a lot of power to deny enemy troops the opportunity to move into the mid-board if they wanted to. The Krieg Command Squad I think have some particularly fun and themed miniatures, led by a Lord Commissar and having a rather fun banner bearer, Master Vox operator and some hangers-on including those servo scribes. They're £28 or $45 and quite a cool little headquarters unit I think. In game they'd basically be the option if you wanted to bulk out an advancing infantry squad threat, to have its own orders, a few more bodies in the squad, and a few other leadership style advantages that the Commissar-led squad gets. The Master Vox could also be an option for comboing with Lord Solar as well, maybe tied together in an infantry squad that's hiding in the backfield, and allowing him to broadcast his orders around the board. I feel like they might be a little bit on the niche side of things in terms of in-game power compared with a few of them though perhaps. The Death Riders of Krieg are the plastic incarnation of the rather disturbing Krieg Steed cavalry with clawed hooves and gas masks on. Some quite fun miniatures these ones I think, quite a good sense of motion with them galloping across the board. They are fairly expensive for the amount of points that you get on the board though at £40 or $62 US. In game at the moment, unfortunately their rules are a bit on the underwhelming side. Games Workshop seems to want them to be sort of skirmishing nuisance-style cavalry as opposed to being mainline damage dealers like the Rough Riders. And I feel like they're missing something like maybe the Scout keywords to get them into more advanced and threatening positions. Maybe somewhere where they're going to actually make a bit better use of their reactive move rule at 70 points versus the Rough Riders 60. For 5 of them though, they just don't really compete very well at the moment. And to be honest, if you wanted to use some Krieg cavalry in game, I'd be kind of tempted just to run them as the Rough Rider datasheet. They do basically just have the exact same gear, with fancy hunting lances and some carbines. Finally, for the dedicated Krieg kits, we've got Lord Marshal Dreyer. He's quite an expensive character miniature at $60 or £37. It's really quite a fun miniature though, standing on his Krieg steed on top of a whole bunch of barbed wire and things, and options to assemble him with either his pistol or his sword drawn. You might be able to find copies of his miniatures going at a little bit cheaper second hand, given that he came in the big Krieg launch box, and typically if people bought 2 of that set they wouldn't really want 2 of him, so it could be worth shopping around if you did want to pick him up. Unfortunately in-game he's not really very good at the moment, at least for the 100 points that he was on the Guard Codex launch. I'd hope they might reduce that, given that his datasheet's interesting enough, just not doing enough for the points cost really. Basically he's hard to kill with a revive on death rule, has 3 orders for regiment things, presuming stuff sticks close enough to be able to be in range of that, and gives the Death Riders devastating wounds on the charge, which can add up to a fair bit with the sheer amount of attacks that they have, but unfortunately against tougher targets it only really means that they're kind of breaking even versus the Rough Riders, while paying a whole bunch of points for the character upgrade privilege. Hopefully Games Workshop will either give him some sort of rules boost or drastically cut his points cost at some stage. Those are the mainline Krieg units, and I'll just touch on a few options for other expansion things for the Astra Militarum. I feel like it's going to be a rare guard force, Krieg included, that don't have some Lehman Russes in their ranks. They're one of the best ways to get points in the army for a little bit cheaper than the very expensive cavalry and infantry, and are quite a fun and flexible kit. They have all the different turret options included now, which is nice. I'd certainly be tempted to magnetise the turret, and I personally leave the sponson and hull mounted things unglued so you can swap them around at will. They can be good enough to stay in with friction fit, or use some tiny magnets or some blue tack or something. Most of the variants are fairly well playable right now, maybe things like the Vanquisher, Exterminator and Mainline Battle Tank being my favourites. Otherwise, for other options to expand, Scout Sentinels are rarely a bad idea, scouting up the board and marking targets with their reroll ones to hit. The armoured version pictured isn't too bad for a fairly tanky distraction unit. I'd probably equip them with las cannons either way. The Rogel Dawn Battle Tank is another way to get a bunch of points on the board, though not quite as money efficiently as the Lehman Russ. Currently I'd go with the Oppressor Cannon, Pulverizer Cannon and Melter Sponsons, and run it as the Tank Commander variant, where you can also get a bonus order to order something else as well as it. For infantry and artillery armies, then having something to stand in for Ursula Creed could be quite nice. I guess you could convert her physical model to look a bit more Krieg-like, though to be honest I'd probably just go the route of just kit bashing something out of another infantry model. It's maybe not really too hard to represent a model with dual pistols and a power sword. You just need to get something the right base for her. A few deep striking Tempestus Scions could be nice enough. They can drop down and do secondaries and mission things, and maybe also have a little bit of firepower to threaten enemy stuff with their special weapons. Gaunt's Ghost or Calidus Assassin can also be good for the same role. Again, you could convert maybe some Krieg-themed stand-ins, perhaps out of a command squad or combat engineers or similar. And for transports, the Taurox is the one that seems to be more in fashion over the Chimera. Maybe it could be nice enough for delivering combat engineers into mortal wound range with its big movement. Otherwise, for options to expand, the Combat Patrol for Astra Militarum I don't think is all that useful for Krieg. It's really quite Cadian and Attilan Rough Rider themed. Given a Cadian command squad and Kazakin, it's very much going down non-Krieg themes there. And I feel like for most people wanting to pick up cavalry, they'd be wanting to go for the Death Riders if they're going mainly Krieg first. Just a bit of an odd collection of units in the first place really, and it's not been very popular. Though still, if you're collecting a more general combined force guard, it's not useless as an expansion box. Finally, just for other miniature options out there, you could mix in some Solar Auxilia models as well if you wanted a few more Guardsman style miniatures that have bodies a fair bit cheaper. They're not really quite the same style as Krieg. You could maybe use them for something like armoured elites like Kazakin perhaps, or maybe just rank and file infantry, though you might want to find some gas mask style head swaps. You do get more of them per amount of money spent. As mentioned earlier, if you wanted something to stand in for a Mars Alpha pattern Lehman Russ, you could look at their Heresy era versions of that. I guess the only downside with 40k is that it doesn't come with sponsons, and they are kind of auto-include at the moment. You could do some sort of conversion work, and I have seen some conversion kits that use some sort of recess style sponsons, which were kind of fun, but another option that could have a few more style points if you wanted. In general though, when expanding a Warhammer 40k army of just about any stripe, there's always a lot of scope for just collecting what you like the look of and building up more options as you go along. In general, it's seen as far more important to have an army that you just love and like the feel of, and maybe have a few nods to trying to make it a bit more playable in game, as opposed to just literally chasing the latest meta list with a bunch of miniatures that you don't really like so much. Things do tend to cycle around, and at time of recording, the majority of the Guard army is at least fairly usable. Maybe a few things that are underpowered currently are a few of the artillery things, which don't seem to have quite as much direct damage as the artillery teams or the field ordnance, and things like flyers and fortifications just generally seem to be left high and dry in 10th edition without Games Workshop wanting to balance them. For the most part though, I generally aim to build up a balanced core of the army and add elements that interest you bit by bit. A lot of people go out and get a fair bit of stuff so they can actually start playing games fairly quickly, but beyond that it probably makes more sense to build up slowly and gradually after that, after you've actually got some paint on the miniatures, so you aren't just faced with an endless tide of grey miniatures to demotivate you. I'd probably have a 2,000 point army list and work towards it, playing games and adapting as you go. Talking of army lists, here's just one example of a fairly fun and fluffy siege regiment army list. The idea behind this one is to use one of each of the Death Korps of Krieg units, if not more, and put something on the board that should be at least somewhat effective in siege regiments. For this one, to lead the force, we've got the Death Korps of Krieg Command Squad taking that bonus take cover order enhancement, Lord Marshal Dreyer to lead a squad of 10 Death Riders, and a model to represent Ursula Creed converted to be a Death Korps model. They'll be leading a main infantry and cavalry advance. There's 2 units of 20 Death Korps with melters and plasmas in them, and they could be okay users of the orders and stratagems for a bit more damage up close. Converted Krieg will go with some Cadian shock troops, again fielded as Death Korps of Krieg infantry but just marked out differently, and sitting as a bit of a command unit in the back, and she'll be ordering a set of 3 artillery teams, all armed with siege cannons to provide some pretty fearsome strength 12 and damage 3 firepower that might be able to combine with the ignores cover from the detachment rule if you use that one. And there's also a Sentinel and a Lehman Russ Exterminator on the board, so you could add yet more debuffs to the enemy units to make those shells land home with a vengeance. Otherwise, moving up the board, there's a couple of Tauroxes with combat engineer squads in sight. They can scout up a little way, and then the good movement should be able to get them in range for the mortal wounds and just act as cheaper nuisance and screening units. There's 2 sets of the Death Korps heavy weapon teams with flamers. They can move up to put some hurt on enemy infantry in the midboard and maybe threaten Overwatch if it made sense. A cheap squad of Scions to deep strike in to do secondary objectives, and to back up that Lehman Russ Exterminator there's a scary Rogel Dawn tank commander, fairly fearsome firepower in his own right, being able to order both of the tanks and potentially use that 4 rerolls to hit at 12 inches stratagem. It certainly isn't necessarily the most competitive or optimised list in the world, but does make use of a bunch of the Krieg units in at least a fairly effective way with a plan, and with some good damage, cheap units to do secondaries, and some chunky Krieg blocks to take the primaries. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Look forward to hearing your thoughts as to getting a Death Korps of Krieg army on the battlefield. If you've started Death Korps in 10th edition, then let me know how it's been going so far, and particularly if you have any other tips for starting the army. If you'd like something else Guard related to watch, then I'll link my Astra Militarum tier list video down in the video description. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier, a big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out their Guard order things and other dice linked down below. And as mentioned, they've got a vast amount of other stuff on offer as well. If you want things for various other factions, there's that code AUSPEX for 5% off if you wanted to use that as well. Otherwise though, I'll leave that there for now. Feel free to subscribe to AUSPEX Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and there'll certainly be more for the Guard in due course. Check out the Patreon page if you'd like to help support the channel. It is the main thing that allows me to keep the videos coming quite so regularly, so a big thank you to anyone who's helping out there. But just in general, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.